My name is Kari Norgaard, and I'll speak about why we haven't seen more action on climate change. This is an image from my book, Living in Denial: Climate Change Emotions in Everyday Life. And you can see it's people skiing on a ski run of entirely artificial snow, which is something that happened in the community where I did my research. So I want to In the second half of Dr. Mann's talk, he spoke about something about some of the reasons why we haven't had more political action in response to the kind of information and kind of scientific data that's been coming out from the scientific community for a very long time, and gave us a lot of context about that. I myself took a full entire course in climate change in 1988. And yet, despite what would appear to be the most urgent social, political, economic, ecological problem our world has faced, it really, in the United States and around the world to varying degrees, has been treated by the public as sort of no more than background noise. Our lives go on as though it's not happening. We go shopping, we go to the malls, we go to see movies, we take our children to school and put them to bed, and all of these kinds of things seemingly in this parallel universe where there is no climate change. I want to clarify, when I say denial, or what we might also think of, sometimes people think of as the idea of apathy, I want to think a little bit more sort of what is it that I mean? Exactly how might people respond? We can think about this in a whole number of ranges, the ways that this idea of climate change is sort of invisible in our lived experience. It's not something that people talk about with their families or with their friends in a measure that would warrant the seriousness of the problem. It's not something that people are adapting our individual behaviors to in parallel with the scale of the problem. It's not something that's become a public priority, and I want to say I'm talking about making generalizations throughout the world, but especially in those Western democracies where presumably people would have the ability to, through the democratic process, to make these kind of changes. In the United States, we have different ways that we can think about what makes something a public priority. And if you look at these various measures, things that become important in campaigns, whether they're presidential campaigns or campaigns at the local level, or measures of the extent to which it's an important issue for the public in these different ways, the climate change is just not on the list. The economy may be, so forth. Public planning. Is your local community, does their water supply, does their understanding of what may happen to the water supply, does that reflect the actual data that is available for there? Do the various land management agencies, does the health department reflect the increase in asthma, these kinds of things? Different kinds of political action, like people writing letters to the newspaper, or speaking in front of their city councils, or whatever kind of range of political action we might envision that would be appropriate. And lastly, things about the level of social movements. Now, we see some, they see them in various degrees, but on the whole, there's not a reaction on par. So why is this? And certainly, there is a real problem in terms of the contestation of facts, the idea that people can go out and get their own facts. And I myself was attacked by some of the people who've been attacking Dr. Mann and other climate scientists. And so I'm aware of the problem sort of around knowledge and sort of the climate contrarian movement, which our last speaker Peter Sinclair, will also address. But I want to suggest that so far, most of the conversation about why we're not responding has assumed that if we either had the information or people adequately cared, that would take care of it. And I want to remind you, and I don't know the specific figures for Iceland, but certainly even in the United States, where we have a very powerful climate contrarian movement, there are by far more people who do believe climate change is happening, and those people are not doing enough either. And that this is the kind of denial I want to talk about. The other piece besides the information piece is the idea, well, and especially perhaps it's easy to point fingers at the United States. We have a reputation for being very self-interested. Americans are just greedy. We can only think about our own self-interest. We can't be bothered about what's happening in the rest of the world. So this idea maybe that we just don't care enough is another idea that's out there, perhaps more in the public eye than necessarily in the social scientific literature. So I want to think for a second, or have you think with me for a second about two really significant threats, I think, to our democracy, to our idea of democracy, that are happening in this moment. And one of them is the idea that the facts no longer matter, as Dr. Mann beautifully laid out, the notion of the parallel universe of Fox News channels and all of these kinds of ways, and the ways also that our political leaders have captured the debate, and that although the percentages of Americans that think climate change is happening is still in the majority, what percentage of those in the House of Representatives believe that? These kinds of issues. But that alongside this clearly important threat to the way that we've assumed democracies work, which is that they are grounded in, ever since the Enlightenment, the idea that facts would guide this rational public policy. Alongside that realm of threat, there is another one, and that has to do with our ability to ignore, our ability to distance ourselves or ignore information that is inconvenient, even amongst those people who believe that it's happening. And I draw here on the idea and the work of Stanley Cohen, who's a British sociologist who does work on denial, mostly around human rights. And he talks about different kinds of denial. One of them is the literal type that we're seeing in the climate contrarian movement. It is not happening, literal denial. And a second is sort of the idea of climate denial as interpretive. Well, it may be happening, but it's not human caused. It's not what you think it is. It's not what they say it is. And the third is this idea of implicatory denial, which is the kind of denial that I'm interested in, that I'm saying is actually a very important phenomena for us to understand if we are going to move past the present moment. And in this case, he says the facts, in this form of denial, the facts of children starving to death in Somalia, mass rape of women in Bosnia, a massacre in East Timor, homeless people in our streets are recognized but are not seen as psychologically disturbing or carrying a moral imperative to act. Unlike literal or interpretive denial, knowledge itself is not the issue, but doing the right thing with the knowledge. This sense that something that is truly threatening that is truly an ethical issue, as Dr. Mann closed, that this is not being addressed as such. And as a sociologist, I want to paint for you a picture in which what looks like public apathy, what looks like people just don't care or just don't know what's really going on, is actually not, it doesn't just happen, and it's not just inevitable, but that it actually takes a certain kind of work. It takes a kind of work that we do together. And this is a work of making meaning and a work of creating a political silence. And so I want to say that this apathy is like actually an active process, and it's something we're doing together. So for those who may be interested, I am often thought of as a psychologist, but I am not, although I do draw on social psychology. There are a number of very powerful theories in social psychology that are, I think, important to this, what I want to describe. I'm very interested in the sociology of emotion, the ways that emotions shape how we think and how we collectively do reality. And cultural practices, conversations, how we talk, how we use humor in order to create a certain reality, a comfortable reality, but a reality that is nonetheless not going to get us into the blue curves of the 2-degree world in the future, which is what really is what we need to be comfortable. And finally, how, like the climate contrarian movement is nested in current economic power relationships as well, are how these sort of practices of normalization are. So I'm telling you the story a little bit backwards, but I'll take a minute to say that how I came to what I'm talking to you about and what is reflected in a book. I see a couple of copies running around here. Is based on 10 months of ethnographic work. I am third generation Norwegian American, and I did this original work in Norway. I also have done follow-up work in the United States, and also a whole series of interviews and content analysis and so forth. And as I said, I did the bulk of the ethnographic work, which means basically going and looking at everyday life, looking at how does the idea of climate change enter or not enter just our everyday lives. Is a very different approach than polling data, which is also really important. Do you check that you think climate change is very important, number 5, or very likely or somewhat likely to be actually occurring, this kind of thing. And so why did I do this work in Norway? Norway is a country that it's very hard to make an argument in Norway that people don't know information. It's a very highly educated place, has the highest level of newspaper readership in the world, a very standardized education system and so forth. It's hard to make an argument that people aren't politically engaged generally, as you could certainly in the United States. Political apathy in the United States is rampant. But in Norway, there's a very high level of political participation in many, many levels from the local on up. There's, of course, in the Arctic, as you know, changes in the climate are more pronounced. And so we see there's more opportunities for people to have conversations and so forth. People in Norway have had historically a very strong identification with nature, the natural world, part of sort of a sense of national identity. Extremely high quality of life, so you can't really make the argument that people, as you certainly can in the United States, that people just can't afford to do something, because if any country could afford or would seem to care, a place that has such strong environmental, humanitarian, social equality types of values, here would be a place. And so because I had spent time there living there before, it's a country that's shaped my own thinking in a variety of ways. As I was thinking about this, I chose Norway. It's a particular community that I located myself in of about 10,000 people. And this town has a farming economy, has a small ski area that's important for tourism. And that winter, it did happen that there was unseasonably warm weather. The snow came actually 2 months late, which is why people spent an enormous amount of money to open the ski area with 100% artificial snow with great effort. And this has economic and cultural impacts for the community and so forth. A woman fell into the lake because it wasn't frozen enough for ice fishing, or excuse me, she drowned. The lake would be frozen enough. So these are just sort of different things that happened that were visible evidence that the immediate conditions were different. And so, but despite this, what I noticed as I went around in all of the various places that I did the work I did, although people did believe that climate change was actually happening that the reason that the snow was so late and that it was so warm was climate change, it was not becoming made into an issue of any kind of political concern. It was this sense of living in a parallel universe. And so I talk about this community as Bygdeby, which was just a name that means a town. The word in Norwegian, and perhaps Icelandic too, I don't know, describes a town of about this size, halfway between a by, a city, and a bygd, which is the rural district. So in Bygdeby, the possibility of climate change was both disturbing and almost completely invisible, simultaneously unimaginable and common knowledge. I'm going to give you some quotes. It was something that people felt that they had to sit themselves down and think about, didn't really think about in every day, But in between was discouraging and an emotional weight. And so, drawing on the work of historical psychologist Robert Lifton, I talk about this as a double reality. There's a sense of an abstract knowledge, but it is not integrated into an everyday experience. A couple more examples. This one woman described how I often get afraid, like it goes very much up and down then with how much I think about it. But if I sit myself down and think about it, it could actually happen. If I thought about how this here continues, we could come to have no difference between winter and spring and summer, and lots of stuff about the ice that's melting and that there will be flooding, like it's depressing the way I see it. So again, this sense of it's there, but it's not there, and also a little bit of a hint of why she doesn't want to think about it. Why is it that we have this presumed apathy? Why is it that we are not more engaged? Even the majority of people who do believe science and do believe what's happening. And based on the interviews that I did, I highlighted 3 emotions that people associated, that people experienced when listening, when watching talks like this, that were disturbing. The feeling of guilt, the fear about the future, and a sense of helplessness. And actually, since giving this talk, this didn't emerge from my research, but people in audiences like yourselves have suggested that that anger is another emotion that they experience. And anger, I don't know exactly the role that anger might or might not play. It seems to me that anger might play some role potentially in mobilizing people. But I want to talk about how these emotions can, and I would propose do, play a role in people sort of keeping this experience private and in dampening public outrage. So for one thing, I have under each emotion here this sort of a second line. And this is referring to the idea that guilt is disturbing to us, in part because it goes against how we want to see ourselves, as individuals, as good people, and how we want to see ourselves perhaps as members of a national community, as good Icelanders, Americans as good people, Norwegians as good people, a sense of national pride that goes against, in contradiction with that experience of guilt. Fear of the future threatens our sense of what can be called ontological security, our sense that the world will go on in any kind of a predictable way. And finally, the emotion of helplessness going against a sense of identity that has to do with our ability to affect change in the world. Psychologists, this is where again I'm drawing on social psychological theories, say that we have a real need to be able to feel that we can do something in our lives. It's part of an inherent need. And so when we perceive that we cannot, this is going against that need. So I want to give you some examples of quotes in people's words. So this from a Norwegian: we go on vacation and we go shopping and my partner drives to work every day. We feel that we must do it to make things work on a practical level, but we have a guilty conscience, a bit of a guilty conscience. This from an American: I find that there's a kind of guilt because the way we live culturally and the way we've been raised is so contrary to our ideals in a lot of ways. You can be against global warming to a certain extent, but we're still heating our homes and driving our cars and shipping our food long distances. It's really hard to live in a social context and be aligned with your beliefs on the environment. And here she's referring also sort of to that a lot of the idea of the social fact that we exist in a fossil fuel organized economy and so forth, and we cannot, as individuals, change that overnight. The second emotion that I'm honing in on here is the idea of fear. We've now come so far that this is from a Norwegian, a local political figure, that we've begun to see that to protect or not protect the environment we're living in 100 years, it's possible the environment will be damaged to the point it's not possible to live on Earth anymore, you know? And from an American student, young person, when I hear Bill McKibben speaking and they talk about the tipping point, fear comes in with helplessness. Oh my God, there is nothing. I found out, we're 50 years away from the worst. We haven't even felt the effect of what we're doing now. It makes me think we can't do anything. It's already beyond help, and there's the fear. And again, the fear, you can see sort of a connection with the third emotion of helplessness. So this, first from a Norwegian, I think there are a lot of people who feel that no matter what I do, I can't do anything about that anyway. And then from the American, that's like where I feel the most helpless. It's like, I know this stuff. I have all this information, but what the hell do I do with it? I don't know where to turn. I don't know who to talk to. Yeah, I can write my congressman a letter, but in all honesty, I'm not sure one person can make such a difference. And so thinking about, in Iceland, there's such a closer proximity that you have to your political community. In the United States, there's that deep sense of alienation. And that thinking about how this may be in different kinds of contexts as well. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that people feel this? Unlike some of the principles or ideas of early scientific thought that emotion and reason, or emotion and thought are fundamentally separate, sociologists look, and psychologists for sure as well, at how we feel can it shape how we think. And that we have actually a very profound ability to block out certain things that we don't want to know. One of my respondents, when we were talking about this, he says people want to protect themselves a little bit and puts his hands in front of his eyes as he does so. We can block out information in order to have a coherent sense of meaning of ourselves as good people, of ourselves as living the good life, of being good Americans, or any of these kinds of things, a coherent meaning system that the world is ordered. This is, by the way, not just some flimsy thing. Having a coherent meaning system is fundamental psychological need for us. In order to have a desirable emotional state, to have a good day, to feel fine, to be able to even make it through your day. We have, in the United States, huge numbers of people dealing with depression, all kinds of pharmaceutical responses to that. It's important at some level for us to be able to have a reasonable day, right? Or in the last sense, ability to feel that we have power in the world. And we can think of any other numbers of reasons that we might not want to think about a certain thing. And so I want to move us now a little bit into the sociology of this, because as much as all of that's true, it's mostly in the psychological realm. But what I'm interested in is that the process of doing this is not just something we do with our hands, but we actually do it together. And so denial is not just an individual thing. Most people thinking about denial, again, think about it in a psychological framework. That's relevant. I want to talk about it in a sociological framework. And I want to, again, put on the table, we've talked about the idea of power, the power to censor a scientist, the power to take a military action, the power to pass a climate bill or not. That's an incredibly important power. But another sort of form of power is just the ability to shape what people can even imagine as possible. And this is in the realm of denial. So drawing on political theorist Stephen Lukes, this idea that is it not the supreme and most insidious exercise of power to prevent people, to whatever degree, from having grievances by shaping their perceptions, cognitions, and preferences in such a way that they accept their role in the existing order of things, either because they can see or imagine no alternative to it, or because they see it as natural and unchallengeable. So this is the background. Can we imagine climate change? Can we imagine that we can do anything about it? Sociologists talk about sort of how do we construct reality? And there's an idea of a cultural toolkit that we all sort of have available, different resources through which we create the day-to-day. And we do this in part by collectively having things that is normal to think about. How far in the future, how far across time and space do we think? What do we talk about in all different kinds of settings? And what is it socially acceptable to feel? How much emotion can we show legitimately indifferent and still be taken as a legitimate whatever, human, scientist, whatever, however we identify? And we moderate ourselves to stay in these, and we collectively co-create them as we do this. And so I'll give you a few examples of how we do this. Selective attention, in the words of one person, we can't dig ourselves into depression, right? So by controlling our exposure to information, we can keep a sense of having a nice enough day, or not becoming so hysterical about the information or the possibility for whatever future scenario that we are seen as crazy. Activists describe how they read very little of the details, and it's better not to know everything, or this idea that you have the knowledge, but you live in a completely different world. One person described not allowing herself to think so far ahead. It's terrible to think that we live so well while others live in such miserable conditions. Of course, it's very good to have a comfortable life. I enjoy it, but I feel so bad about the others. I have a guilty conscience. That's why I try not to think about it, to keep it at a distance. And there's another sort of, in addition to sort of following the normal practices of what to talk about, what to think about, and what to feel. And again, this is a book length. I have multiple chapters of examples of this. This is just sort of enough to perhaps show you the picture here. In addition to those kinds of things, there's also narratives and discourses that we have that we use to construct a sense of what is normal. And so there's a lot of examples where, when pressed with the idea that perhaps something should be done differently in Norway, or perhaps there's a sense of guilt felt around something. People all around the world, perhaps in Iceland as well, you can let me know if this rings true here, will say that at least they're not as bad as the Americans. There's also a common phrase, Norge er et lite land. Norway is a small country, so we're just a little player on the stage. Well, in terms of oil and gas development, Norway is actually a really pretty substantial player, and both materially and symbolically, because Norway is seen as a more environmentally friendly place. So it's not, but this sort of sense that Norway is so little, there's nothing we can do. Lets people off the hook. Or sort of a background emphasis, actually Norwegians are very down-to-earth people who are very environmental and live these rural, simple lives. And this is an image, here I'm drawing on the work of Thomas Hilland Eriksson, who talks about the different pieces of the national identity. And this is a postcard that I purchased in the town where I was living, which shows a child, sort of innocence, on old-fashioned wooden skis, so that's sort of down to earth, back to very simple life, with of course the national flag and the out in nature skiing. So this sort of as this sort of background sense. Well, actually Norwegians, things are very good here. Things are very clean. We're a good people. I think I've been very impressed with Norway in so many ways, and I actually think it's because I feel a lot of admiration for Norway that I'm putting the really, really hard question of our times up against sort of on this stage. Another example of how this happens is the idea of what Robert Lifton coined a term of claims to virtue. And this is when is an example of interpretive denial. You take yourself, you say you're doing something that's questionable, but you actually claim it to be a very good thing. Now, he coined this term. He described this phenomena after his work interviewing and working with Nazi doctors who gave Jews lethal injections during the Holocaust. And they justified what they had done in killing people as humanitarian, because they said they were helping more people to live by killing only the weaker and older people. So this is the context in which he came up with this idea of claims to virtue. But these, we can look at any number of them, that gas plants are better than coal, and therefore Norway should continue with the development of natural gas facilities that's recently occurred, or that Norwegian oil is cleaner, and therefore it's better to have Norwegian oil on the market, and instead of reducing CO2 emissions, as Norway has pledged to do. So I go through and look in these various spaces. How is it that people actually talk about climate change in different kinds of contexts where it might come up? And how did it, when it did come up, how did it fail to stay in the public, or sorry, in that conversation? And I encourage you to try these yourselves, to try to talk about climate change with people in different contexts and see what happens. And you can come up with your own list. And if you want to send them to me, I'll be interested in what you find out. People have been doing this actually since I've been giving this talk. And so in any case, in certain kinds of conversations, like when you're making small talk, in this community, I observed actually that was one of the places that climate change could come up. Because it could come up in this little fleeting way, like, oh, yeah, really unusual weather. Yeah, I wonder if it's global warming. And then it was okay to sort of, you weren't going to talk to that person for very long anyway, so it was almost like it's okay to mention it in that context because you were on your way somewhere else. But it wasn't really very easy to talk about climate change in a more serious way in educational settings, in part because there was a continual pressure that people felt in order to have to be optimistic. I do believe it's important, extremely critical, that we talk about that there is a future, that there is a way for us forward, for us to go. But I think that if the feeling that climate change is too depressing of a topic to talk about in an educational setting, obviously age appropriate, that's not helpful. That is where it's curbing the information getting out. Anyway, this is a table from my book. I make this model where on the one side, these emotions that I mentioned, fear or helplessness, talk about the different kinds of emotion norms, what's normal, what's appropriate in different contexts, and then the sort of strategies. So I've given you some of each of these different parts. How did people manage to fit the appropriate norm or reinforce it in different cases in conversations? So guilt goes against the sense that you should be proud of who you are, of being Norwegian or being American, and so you can say, this is reading off the bottom, well, at least we're not as bad as the Americans, and Norway's a small country anyway, this kind of thing. I also noticed that there's different kinds of conversational tactics, humor, a sense of really focusing on the facts rather than allowing yourself to feel some of the disturbing information, shifting attention elsewhere, controlling exposure to information, these kinds of things. And in closing, I want to tie the third part of this here, because I talked about individual emotions. I've spoken about the idea that there are cultural norms and cultural resources for us to normalize, to make things okay again for ourselves and for each other, to get rid of that pesky, fearful feeling of helplessness in this moment. I won't say, I do these myself. I mean, I've become very aware of this now, and I'm thinking, so how we think and how we feel is not only, not just an individual thing, it's also, again, related to these cultural practices and tied into where you live, in your national economic context. People in Tuvalu, it wouldn't look like this, I'm guessing, right? It's going to look a little bit different. So in Norway, despite the common sense of, oh, we're a very small country, was last year the world's fifth largest oil exporter and second largest exporter of natural gas. This production has increased dramatically prior to the time that I spent in this community. The oil and gas industry account for a quite significant percentage of carbon emissions, as you presumably know. Unlike in the United States, where that income is going into the hands of a very few, in Norway, that income is actually going into the very high quality of life that people have, and into an oil fund, which is considered one of the most successful and secure investments ever in the world. So this matters. This economic context matters. It's part of why people feel guilt. It's part of how it can feel helpless to think about moving beyond. So again, it's not just psychological, this idea of a micro level individual, meso level of culture, and macro level of economic that work together. What is at stake for us is, of course, human survival, the survival of our societies and our lives as we know it, all kinds of ecological systems, all of these things. We are, the idea that we are just not acting because we don't know is really about, is ignoring the privilege that we have and the fact that we do have a lot of power to act. Perhaps some of you in the room are oil executives. Probably most of us are not. So we don't have the same degree of potential ability to change things necessarily as some people might. But all of us as members of the public and those of us that are in different kinds of political positions do have some responsibility, I think, to act. And the idea that it's just information that's in the way is disingenuous. Of course, there are huge questions about democratic power that are implicated in all of this. And I think we need to figure out and ask, and probably some of you will ask, under what conditions, how we can mobilize people in this sort of new reality where I think the desire and the ability to ignore are, in some sense, greater than ever. So thank you.